And so the Franco-Irish connections are really wonderfully interesting to explore. And they are quite important for understanding AE, particularly his relationship with James Stephens, who was one of his great friends, and also the amazing, extraordinary, unpublished in English, Simone Téry, who is, in my view, one of the most astute commentators on Irish literature. She writes a little compact history of the Irish literary revival, published in 1925, L'Île des Bards, which Laura will talk about in more detail in a moment. A.E. visited Paris in 1926 for a few weeks to converse with James Stephens and Simone Téry, who were both there at the same time. So we're going to talk a little bit about James Stephens, the friendship, and then later Laura will talk about Simone Téry in detail. So I have a portrait here by A.E., which I'll send around to you, of James Stephens. So notice in the portrait by A.E., he always catches the light. So when he was in the art galleries in Paris, he wasn't so much interested in the art history of the different artists. He'd study how they used light. And you can see that James Stephens is a very ordinary Dublin guy, comes out of poverty. I'll talk about that in a moment. Very short, strong he went to the gymnastic studio in Dublin, but he was one of the most interesting Irish writers that people don't know a lot about. The masterpiece is The Crock of Gold. He published that in 1912. So when James Joyce met him, James Joyce had yet to publish Dubliners, that's 1914, or Portrait of the Artist, 1916, or obviously Ulysses, 1922. So the up-and-coming Dublin writer was James Stephens. And they had this very tense meeting in 1912. 1912 is the year Stephens publishes The Charwoman's Daughter and The Crock of Gold, his two masterpieces. He will write The Demigods in Paris. So he has his Parisian phase. So James Stephens is almost anticipating James Joyce before James Joyce. So another very interesting figure. He worked as a clerk in Merrion Square. So we just had fantastic inaugural unveiling of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, number 70, Merrion Square. James Stephens was in 91 Merrion Square as a clerk before he was discovered by A.E. And A.E., of course, worked in number 84, Plunkett House, for most of his life. Okay, so I'll send this around to look at, this fantastic portrait. Just move it around, and then we'll go through the slides here really quickly. Laura, do you mind to do that? Yeah. So very quickly, this is the great James Stephens. So he came out of poverty. Now, what's interesting about him is that he claimed to have the same birthday, actually, as James Joyce. Most biographers, Hilary Pyle, Turlock mentioned Hilary, of course, also a biographer of Susan Mitchell. Hilary Pyle is the most interesting chronicler and biographer of James Stephens. But she says his birth is probably 1880, but he claimed to February 2nd, 1882, as the same as James Joyce. When he was in Paris in the late 1920s, he was very friendly with James Joyce. The initial hostility became friendship, and he actually asked James Stephens to finish Finnegan's Wake. And it's actually kind of witty, because he said, then we could sign the book J.J. and Sons, which of course is John Jameson and Sons, the Dublin whiskey. So, but Joyce was able to finish the Finnegan's Wake by himself. Okay, so Stephens he dies in London, more or less in poverty, but it's the great friendship is between himself and A.E. Okay, want to keep going there? All right, thanks. So the character of A.E. is the character of the philosopher in The Crock of Gold. The philosopher is the one who goes on a journey to find his thin wife, who leaves him in frustration because he's so removed inside his own head. And I think myself that's an allegory of the difficult relationship A.E. actually had with his English wife, Violet North, because she's almost invisible in the biographies. People say he almost never talked about his family. He had several sons, 2 sons by her. And so Violet is very much in the background. And I think James Stephens is intuiting that emotional tension in the relationship. Okay, keep going here. So very quickly, I talked about this last night, the 4 phases of A.E.'s career. I'll just mention this briefly. So A.E. is a mirror to us all, an ideal, the Aristotelian idea in Western philosophy is that we all have potentiality that may grow into actuality. And the fullest development, according to Aristotle, of our potential of human beings is, can we become a great soul? This is the extraordinary challenge that Aristotle sets down. And the ideal of the great soul is the sage. And A.E., I contend, through the 4 phases of his career, which we can see as the acorn phase as a youth, from 1878 to 1897, when he has raw mystical experiences. Then he starts learning mystical literature, studies theosophy, esotericism, Western esotericism, through the books of Madame Blavatsky, The Secret Doctrine particularly. That takes him up into his 20s, almost 30 years old. And then he marries Violet, who he meets in the Theosophical household, joins the Agricultural Organization Society, the cooperative movement of which Patrick will speak much more fully. And that's the maturation from having esoterical, mystical knowledge into the young acorn has become a sapling. The sapling is growing into a young oak. And that is the integration of a vision for a rural civilization, an ideal he called the commonwealth of cooperatives. And then he works with the Irish Agricultural Society. According to his biographer, he visits every county in Ireland, sees the poverty, the Gombianism, the drunkenness, all of the different ways that Ireland is being held back spiritually, psychologically, culturally. And this is what he writes about and criticizes, right? And so he anticipates writers like Friel, who come out of the 1950s and the 60s, who also try and figure out ways to caustically criticize problems psychologically, spiritually, emotionally through theater. A is doing that through his editorial work as he becomes the mature oak as an editor from 1905 to 1920 with the Irish Homestead. And then the final phase is as the regal, majestic sage, the great soul, who then does his visit to Paris in 1926 and then visits the United States, where he's celebrated in 1928. He gets an honorary doctorate from Yale also in 1928, and then the 2 great lecture tours, 1930, the 1934 and 1935, where he dines with Roosevelt in the White House in January 1935. And if it wasn't for the fact that he was dying of cancer, he would have made a much greater impact, certainly in America. He comes home and dies in Bournemouth. And then his friends do their best to resurrect his career. Want to keep going? Sorry. That's the 4 phases. So in 1907, during that maturing of A.E., when he had become from a mystic to a seer, to a teacher, to a mentor, to a cooperative economist and social philosopher, this is when he started to read James Stephens's work in Arthur Griffith's journal, the Sinn Féin. And he went to Merrion Square to discover James Stephens. My favorite story actually about James Stephens is that he was so hungry, and he's a little guy. He was so hungry that he had to fight a dog for a crust of bread that found on the ground. So himself and the dog are like fighting over the crust of bread. But then he becomes a clerk in Merrion Square, number 91. And that's where he is writing. Unfortunately, it's kind of the curse of James Stephens' career, because he was a diminutive gentleman. He constantly got compared to a leprechaun, which used to constantly annoy him very much. And I actually find that I sympathize about how annoying that must have been for this very imaginative, experimental prose artist. Okay, keep going, Laura. Thank you. So A.E., as we've talked about here, A.E. becomes the luminous center. And so into the salon culture that A.E. is leading in that 3rd phase of his career, a 2nd phase into the 3rd phase, 1905 to 1920, in Rathgar, James Stephens is discovered and then is invited to the Sunday at homes in Rathgar, and then his conversational brilliance starts to unfold. He gives a great account of meeting in the Bailey pub with people like Oliver St. John Gogarty, who is, of course, Buck Mulligan and Ulysses, and just seeing how they could just quote all kinds of classical literature in multiple languages, and Stephens saying, I had to learn how to have that same facility, that same training of memory, that same command of poetry and verse. And that's joining the Irish literary renaissance as an author this time was a hard discipline. The conversational brilliance was not trivia. it was quotation, it was memorization, it was performance, it was being possessed by the spirit of a culture reviving itself, awakening itself, but also having reference to classical sources, etc. Okay? But he met the challenge, James Stephens did. So the friendship is incredibly important to AE. George Moore gives an account of it in his great memoir, Hail and Farewell. And he said that, this famous description, he said that when he went into the Marion Square office of the solicitors, Macready's, number 91 Marion Square, he says that two big brown eyes looked up. He says, who's this James Stephens? Does anybody know James Stephens? And this two big brown eyes looked up from the typewriter. And the clerk answered, I am he. And the rest is the raising of a clerk, an ordinary Dublin worker who aspired to be a writer, the magic, magnifying quality of AE's luminosity, his spirituality, raises James Stephens. Yeah. Want to keep going, Laura? One more? So then he becomes the inspiration for the old philosopher. So James Stephens writes a series of articles in the Sinn Féin called The Old Philosopher. And The Old Philosopher is, this is a parody of the at-homes in Rathgar where AE is pontificating. And so it's the philosopher is talking about washing or politeness or smoking. And then the brilliance of these discourses will feed into The Crock of Gold, okay, which is the great masterpiece by James Stephens. You want to keep going, Laura? I hope you guys can see this illustration from The Crock of Gold. This is a reprint, so first published 1912, and then this is from 1926. This is the English illustrator Thomas Mackenzie, who's very influenced by Audrey Beardsley, and a little bit by Harry Clarke. And so it's an Art Nouveau element. And so this is the AE character. If you know, anybody know the Crock of Gold story where the philosophers spin out of existence? They say, your conversation to me, oh friend, has become so tedious that it is now time for me to spin out of existence. And so one philosopher jumps up and literally starts spinning. He spins himself out of existence. So it's just one philosopher left. And that is the AE philosopher here. And in the illustration here, it says, they sit in silence but listen to each other's thoughts. So they can hear. It's almost like a psychic membrane has opened between the philosophers. They can hear each other's talk. Okay, very good. Keep going. And so I'm going to stop here. My timer is about to go off. So Paris, as Paris had come to Dublin in Simone Téry, Dublin would have to come to Paris. I just want to read one other quotation from The Charwoman's Daughter, also published in 1912, in which James Stephens describes what it was like to see AE walk the streets of Dublin, right? And so Mary Make-Believe is the character. She's the innocent, looking at the various characters of Dublin. And she says the following: there was a tall man with a sweeping brown beard whose heavy overcoat looked as though it had been put on with a shovel. Famous description of AE. He wore spectacles and his eyes were blue and always seemed as if they were going to laugh. He also looked into the shops as he went along, and he seemed to know everybody. Every few paces, people would halt and shake his hand, but these people never spoke because the big man with the brown beard would instantly burst into a fury of speech which had no intervals. And when there was no one with him at all, he would talk to himself. On these occasions, he did not see anyone, and people had to jump out of his way while he strode onwards, swinging his big head from one side to the other, and with his eyes fixed on some place a great distance away. Once or twice in passing, she heard him singing to himself the most lugubrious song in the world. And that's AE in Dublin, from an uneducated character's sort of naive appreciation. Okay, so now I'll turn over to Laura.
This was just a few shots from Paris. This is the street where James Stephens' apartment was, Rue Campagne Première in the 14e arrondissement. And then the cafe that he would haunt, the Closerie des Lilas, in the Montparnasse district. And if you go into that cafe, the tables all have plaques of famous writers. I don't believe there's one for James Stephens, but
there is one for Samuel Beckett.
Yeah.
You can sit at the table where Samuel Beckett drank Irish whiskey. The little plaque, which we should all do someday. Go ahead, Laura. Sorry.
So I'll present another portrait of James Stephens through the voice of Simone Téry, who wrote, she was a French journalist and novelist who wrote two significant books about Ireland. The first in 1923, called En Irlande, de la guerre d'indépendance à la guerre civile, so from the War of Independence to the Civil War. And she dedicated to her friends from Ireland. And her second book was published in 1925 called L'Île des Bardes. And she dedicated that book to A.E. and with the addition of Avec mon admiration, ma reconnaissance et mon affection. With my admiration, of course, and my gratitude and my affection. And it's subtitled Notes sur la littérature contemporaine. So it says notes, but they're really astute studies and wonderful word portraits that really paint pictures of the writers that she is portraying in L'Île des Bardes. So I'll be talking more about the second book. Most people are familiar with it's actually the first page of her chapter on A.E., one of the longest, but this is her recognition of all of his contributions. So it just shows the range. So I'll just read a few. She says, are you interested in painting? Go see A.E. Are you wondering how many eggs Carrie exports, or how much linen Alter exports, or what is the best method of cultivating bees? Go see A.E. Do you doubt yourself? Do you find life ugly and insipid? A.E. will comfort you. Do you need a friend? A.E. is always there. And I think, in my opinion, she gives portraits of writers, that we can read today that bring those writers back to life. And so I'd like to read her description of A.E. And she does a wonderful narration of going to his Sunday at home, and as if she's taking the reader along and describing the evening and just how wonderful A.E. is to everyone, from the student to the established writer who attends. But here's a physical description, and then I'll just talk about her recognition of A.E.'s power to empower other people. She writes, sunken into his chair, he smokes his pipe, smiling, and the swirls of smoke blend with those of his long white beard that make him resemble God the Father. One would say that he hides himself in this fluffy beard. It has invaded all that it could of his face. And the clearing of his forehead, where it could not reach, it's threatened by the exuberance of his rebellious hair that A.E. pushes back as soon as the conversation gets animated. His hair, supple and vibrant, surges with wild locks that never could bend to any discipline. A.E. wears like a flag. The traits of his face are concealed by so much vegetation, yet they are the most expressive in the world. Under the mustache, one makes out the smile, but all the life is gathered in his eyes of tender gray blue, luminous, pacified, the blue of the sky after the rain. And in another passage, writes, who would have the nerve to lie to A.E. facing this clairvoyant curiosity? What's the use, since A.E. has seen the thoughts in the soul before one has expressed them? He has fun giving them birth, seeing them pass across faces, evoking them from a shadow, animating them by his breath, kneading them until they are strong and alive. A.E. plays souls like a virtuoso. And finally, before a great superior man, one has a disagreeable feeling of one's own mediocrity. But it's proof that one finds oneself before true greatness when one can say, I didn't know I was so intelligent. One of the secrets of attraction that AE uses is that in his presence, everyone becomes more intelligent. His genius is so modest and so convincing that each person feels grateful for the beautiful things that AE has found. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Simone Téry and then go into her just excerpts that I've interpreted from her chapter. So her parents were Gustave Téry, who was the editor of L'Œuvre, a liberal daily newspaper in Paris. And her mother was also a journalist and novelist. And they divorced when Simone was quite young, and she remarried and took the pen name of her second husband. So she's known as André Violis. And her second husband changed his name because he thought it was too aristocratic sounding, so he went by that pen name. And this is a photo of Simone. And she writes, "Je suis née dans l'encre de l'imprimerie." So I was born in the ink of the printing press. That was inevitable. So I'll just talk a little bit about her. She was born in Carcassonne in southern France. But her father, Gustave, was born in Brittany, and she was, throughout her life, was proud of that Celtic heritage. But I think it was really AE who inspired that pride of the Celtic background on the Breton side. But she was born in Carcassonne and grew up primarily in Paris in a family of journalists and who were all politically engaged. She graduated top of her class and taught French in Rabat, Morocco, until her father, Gustave Téry, asked her to go to Ireland to report on the status of the truce between Ireland and Britain. Although young and relatively new to reporting in a field dominated by men, Simone made impressive contacts and was able to secure many important interviews with political figures such as Eamon de Valera, Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, and members of Sinn Féin. Travel journalism and on-location reporting were somewhat new, and Téry committed herself to giving on-the-spot, realistic, and empathetic reports from locations throughout Ireland. Upon her return, she decided to publish a collection of her articles in 1923 to draw more attention to Ireland. But oftentimes in her father's newspaper, those articles that she was sending, reporting on the truce in Ireland, were on the front page. And so in her book, she does sort of summaries of the key figures. In her first book, she does summaries of the key figures of the War of Independence, and then that includes her interviews and articles. Téry's insightful and candid writing, still unpublished in English and mostly out of print in French, illuminated the humanity of the Irish to the French reading public. She felt that the Irish were misunderstood and caricatured in the French press. She reminded French readers that French and Irish histories were more alike than different. She went on to say that the French should look to the Irish, their cousins, to rediscover the Celtic Gaelic soul that the French had lost. In Ireland, she says, "I discovered with joy that I was a Celt." No doubt that AE inspired this pride. And in fact, shortly before her death, in personal writings, she's reflecting on that, just how proud she was of that Breton heritage. When she returned to France in 1923, she told her father about this self-discovery and begged to go back to Ireland, but he didn't really see the point since Ireland was out of the news at that time, and therefore she published her collection of articles. However, she applied for a grant and was able to return to Ireland and spending a year among the French writers, and brought back her second book called Ile des Bardes, which I showed at the beginning, which was published in 1925, dedicated to AE. And so despite that modest subtitle, it was a brilliant study of the ancient Irish legends in addition to detailed portraits of Yeats, A.E., Synge, James Stephens, George Moore, and James Joyce. It introduced to the French the poets of Ireland, whom she felt were the true warriors who led the Irish to reclaim their identity and soul. So this segment that I'm doing is focusing on James Stephens. Unlike other chapters, this one does not feature the personal interview or the personal conversation. The conversation or interview guised as a conversation, as she does with Joyce in the cafe or with A.E. in multiple conversations and at homes. But nonetheless, it gives us a vivid and sensitive portrait of the artist. So we'll start with my interpretation then of her, or just excerpts of her chapter. She writes, "If you go to take tea at Miss Purser's, the great friend of all writers, who makes the most beautiful stained glass windows in Ireland, and who is, according to Susan Mitchell, the wittiest woman in Ireland, or if you go to A.E.'s Sunday evenings at homes, you'll happen to see a peculiar little being curled on a ball on a sofa. On his small body, he has a big, powerful head, furrowed with deep wrinkles, like soft earth after a storm. Big brown eyes, serious and kind, and mossy hair, which curiously reveals a triangle above his large forehead. Something sweet and ingenuous floats upon his face. He seems to have settled in with familiarity with people, with men, despite not being a man like other men. James Stephens resembles his friends, the leprechauns, these little nimble gnomes who live underground and come out between tree roots, who perch on branches to watch passers-by with curiosity and come and play tricks on humans. James Stephens is a little familiar elf who, from time to time, goes off to tour the Dublin literary salons." You can see that reference to the leprechauns and elves. "But seeing him, you know very well that he does not belong to this world, and that he only comes here to chip away a few pieces of gold that he will bring preciously back to his hole to fatten his treasure. James Stephens, like all supernatural creatures, possesses magic gifts. He just has to open his mouth, and suddenly all conversations stop and everyone listens in awe. He has the curious power to move all of his features at the same time as if they were rubber. When his big eyebrows pull up, all his wrinkles gather and converge on them. The wrinkles of his forehead go down, and those on his cheeks and mouth go up, as if he were pulling purse strings. Naturally, the result is so amusing that a gentle fit of hilarity shakes the body of all those around him. Just as a magician makes the most vicious snakes dance, when he plays with his wrinkles, James Stephens creates waves of joy in even the most gloomy gatherings. His humor bursts forth and bubbles like a clear and joyous spring over white pebbles. With sparkling eloquence, he tells amazing stories where humans look like elves and fairies, and where fairies and elves look like humans. His imagination takes you so far away that you end up rubbing your eyes to make sure you're not dreaming. And yet, most often, he speaks of the most ordinary things. For instance, he tells you about his impressions of Paris, or what happened to him in the streets of Dublin, and what he has read in a French serial. But he touches the banal incidents with his magic wand, and just as Cinderella's good fairy turned a pumpkin into a golden stagecoach, James Stephens' imagination changes his life into the most prodigious adventure. One can say of James Stephens what he himself says of a storyteller in the Demigods. So I'll read the passage that she quotes. "He was a gifted man, for he could tell you a story about nothing at all, and you'd listen to him with your mouth open, and you afraid that he would come to an end of it soon. And maybe it would be nothing more than the tale of how a white hen laid a brown egg. He would tell you a thing you knew all your life, and you would think it was a new thing. There's no old age in that man's mind, and that's the secret of storytelling." So that's the end of the quote in Demigods, and then Simone goes on to say, "There's no old age in James Stephens' mind either, and this is the key to his genius. James is like a very wise, well-behaved child looking at the world. It is to his credit that he kept his youthfulness and his good behavior, because life has not been kind to him. For many years, he knew the misery that one can know in Ireland. For years, he was only an obscure clerk, condemned to boring paperwork all day in order to provide for his family. And all the while, the genius prisoner, like an eagle wounding its wings against the bars of its cage, would rise in him, moaning. At last, one day, A.E. is shown poems where mischievous imagination combines with the freshest lyricism. Delighted to have discovered a new poet in Ireland, he runs to the trading company where he is told James Stephens works. He sees a shy young man sitting behind a typewriter and asks him to take him to the great man. "It's me," James Stephens says. From the day he met the friend that A.E. is, James Stephens was saved. It's truly a wonder that having gone through such dark days, life did not turn on James Stephens. Life did not turn James Stephens into a bitter and hardened person, and that he came with us with such a sensitive and light heart, with all the childhood there is in him. Perhaps it is because he was never subjected to the disenchanting influence of an academic education, because he only went to the school of life, that James Stephens could remain so purely himself, that he could keep this fresh and delightful spontaneity of his childhood, ignorant of all social and human conventions. He has the naive astonishments and infinite curiosities of a child, and because he sees everything with new eyes, he takes us with delight for a walk in a marvelous, dazzling, mysterious world. All life, all nature fills him with exhilaration. Before it, he has the fresh, pure joy of a child. He loves birds. He flies with them into the depths of the trees and from bush to bush and from cloud to cloud. He follows them up there, beyond the sky, to the edge of the infinity, singing joyously. Stephens is a poet in the style of children and young nations. He does not love nature as an aesthete, like a beautiful display to be admired with discernment, but comes to her with his whole body and all his senses. He rolls in her grass, bathes in her streams, climbs up her hills, runs down her slopes. Is that telling me something? Okay. Let me start that over. It's such a lovely passage. He rolls in her grass, bathes in her streams, climbs up her hills, runs down her slopes. He lets all the scents of the earth enter into him. And since he loves nature up close, as he plays with her, she loses her cold and distant air. She comes alive for him. She is full of intentions and feelings, as laughing and as capricious as a playmate, tender and helpful as a mother. It is perhaps this ingenuous pantheism which gives its fresh flavor to James Stephens' poetry. And she has another quote from Demigods, where Stephens is describing an Irish summer. It says, "From the fields nearby came the fresh odor of wild grass, that outbreathed again into the sun his living breath. And the sun shone, not fiercely, but kindly, tempering down the oblique ways, his potent fire. Above their heads and slanting away on wide wings, the birds were sailing, calling a note as they went and calling again. Here were trees once more. Their grave shadows slept on the road, stamping the golden light with the dye of ebony. And the grave voices whispered busily, quietly, like the voices of many mothers who fold against fruitful breasts the little children. So they crooned and sang, rocking their ample greenery on the air." And then she goes on to write, "The nature around him he loves as a poet and wants to follow it inside of himself. He has the charming spontaneity of children. He is and wants to be like them, a creature of instinct and impulse, because what comes from nature cannot be bad. He is as innocent as a naked child who has not yet been spoiled by modesty. How too this little frolicsome Rousseau mistrusts intelligence, which has perverted the human mind. One must follow the heart always. and because all that comes from the heart is true, pure, and beautiful. Listen to the complaint of Angus Og, the god of love, who used to teach men how to find happiness by following nature. She includes the quote, "The world has forgotten me. In all my nation there is no remembrance of me. I, wandering the hills of my country, am lonely indeed. I am the desolate god, forbidden to utter my happy laughter. Where I have kissed, a bird has flown. Where I have trod, a flower has sprung. But thought has snared my birds in his nets and sold them in the marketplace. Who will deliver me from thought, from the base holiness of intellect, the maker of chains and traps?" That's the end of that passage. And she quotes quite a lot of his poetry, which unfortunately not go over well today. Continue with her next critique. His mischievousness with its innocent air respects none of which those in his country respect the most. None of the social, literary, or religious conventions find favor with him. As a fly comes to rest on the nose of the most solemn archbishop, the roguish elf that is James Stephens gets in trouble everywhere, especially where one expects him the least. Disturbing with his burst of laughter, the most ceremonious of ceremonies. But curiously enough, whereas timorous Ireland rose in anger against Yeats and Synge's plays, which were actually not that subversive, Ireland shows exceptional indulgence to James Stephens. James Stephens is Ireland's spoilt child, whose parents, after another of his acts of mischief, say with a smile and a secret sense of pride, "Oh, do you believe this? Isn't he a real enfant terrible?" Which means at his age, it doesn't matter. He doesn't know what he's saying. This is how this ingenuous anarchist could, while playing around and without great people suspecting him, deflate a lot of the balloons of Irish nonsense with his needles. His light banderillas had probably been as effective to beat down the monster of popular prejudice as the spears of armor-clad picadors. It is a dangerous opponent who sings and dances as he fights. He does not know what he's saying? Oh, yes, he does, and much more than one might believe. For James Stephens, who possesses the spontaneity of a child, also has the wisdom of a man who knows the world very well and to whom nature has revealed all her secrets. If he is so joyful, it is because he intends to be, and not because he is blind to the ugly things in life or to human suffering. The poet is a realist in his own right. He sees things and men as they are. His penetrating look knows how to notice the essential trait, the characteristic gesture. Instead of grieving at the stupidity and ugliness that he has seen, he prefers to laugh about them, and he proceeds to dress them in the freshest poetry or the most joyful fancy. This way, his work is a charming mixture of quirky jokes, poetry, disjointed ramble, and sharp and witty observations of the most naked reality. James Stephens, the snide philosopher, the mischievous psychologist, is also a tender-hearted man because he remembers how it feels to be miserable. There's a warm-heartedness in him, a delicate compassion, an almost feminine sweetness, a gentleness which makes him pity and love all the poor and weak who suffer, old men and women, ill-treated donkeys resigned to their fate, and poor starving devils who cannot find a job. What a genuine sympathy for the misery of humble people there is in the admirable soliloquy of the poor woman who wanders along the roads rambling aloud. And in this passage, she's walking and rambling next to the philosopher. So I'll read the passage. Ah, God be with me, an old woman on a stick that hasn't a place in the world to go to or a neighbor itself. I wish I could get a cup of tea, so I do. I wish to God I could get a cup of tea. Me sitting down in my own little house with the white tablecloth on the table and the butter in the dish and the strong red tea in the teacup and me pouring cream into it and maybe telling the children not to be wasting the sugar, the things. Ah, God be with me. An old creature hobbling along the roads on a stick. I wish I was a young girl again, so I do. And himself coming courting me, and him saying that I was a real nice little girl, surely nothing would make him happy or easy at all to be, but me to be loving him. Ah, the kind man he was, to be sure, the kind, decent man, with his soft eyes and his nice voice and his jokes and laughing, and him thinking the world and all of me. Aye, indeed. And then him to be killed on me with the cold on his chest. Ah, then God be with me, a lone old creature on a stick, and the sun shining into her eyes, and she thirsty. I wish I had a cup of tea, so I do. I wish to God I had a cup of tea and a bit of meat, or maybe an egg. A nice fresh egg laid by the speckled-eyed hen that used to be giving me all the trouble, the thing. 16 hens I had, and they were ones for laying, surely. It's a queer world, so it is. The queer world, and the things that do happen for no reason at all. Ah, God be with me. I wish there weren't stones in my boots, so I do. And I wish to God I had a cup of tea and a fresh egg. We can see such tenderness of heart that James Stephens can hide behind his childish pranks and impertinence. And this is what gives his work such an enveloping gentleness and such depth, like a light mist over a luminous landscape. His jokes do not have the irritant dryness of those who do not know how to cry. James Stephens' compassion seduces us like a crease of kindness on laughing lips. But James Stephens is never weepy. You would say he has a reservedness about his feelings. When he has given us a glimpse of his tender brotherly heart, and we are on the verge of tears, he escapes with a sudden caper and a burst of laughter, as if he were afraid of softening, and because it is not appropriate to cry. Life to him is something light that is not worth big laments and long sobs. We must carry it, fragile and charming, as we dance and hum along. So,